Welcome to this session. It is 1 o'clock. This is session 3202, Organic Agriculture, Fad or Future. My name is Brian Copham. I'll be your moderator for this panel. I do have a couple of announcements it is my responsibility to read. I'm going to try to make it as exciting as possible. Before we get started, we would like to mention that this session is underwritten by the CU Environmental Center, which is helping us to reduce the CWA's environmental impact. The center's support has enabled the CWA to purchase carbon offsets for Speaker Airline travel, to reduce its paper consumption, to promote our live streaming platform, and to offer free HOP bus service. We encourage you to make use of these resources during your time at the CWA. I tried a little vocal variety there, see if I could mix it up. Okay, one more. In this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app, some of you may have downloaded that onto your phones or computers, and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. Is anybody here using the app? I think it's relatively straightforward. That's awesome. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers, an environmentally produced pencil. You must write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question. You do have priority. Make your questions brief and to the point. Great. Thank you for joining us. This is a wonderful panel. I'm very excited to participate on it. This is obviously a timely topic. I'm going to introduce our panelists and remind you that this is a roundtable discussion, which means there will not be opening remarks from the panelists. I will, however, ask a question to get the discussion going. To my immediate left is Ann Cure, who is the founder, farmer, co-founder of Cure Organic Farm. Ann and her husband, Paul, farm Cure Organic Farm, 15 acres. They have about 85 pigs. 85 pigs, is that what I read?
We have a lot for a vegetable farm.
Yeah, 100 varieties of vegetables and fruits, and are certainly a fixture in the community here. And then to her left is Raoul. Hang on one second. Raoul Adamchak, the farm manager of the UC Davis Student Farm. Raoul Adamchak has been farming organically for 30 years. He is the co-author with his wife, Pamela Ronald, of Tomorrow's Table, Organic Farming, Genetics, and the Future of Food. In case you are not aware, Raoul's wife is a genetic scientist who does work with GE Foods. This makes a unique couple because, as you know, the issue of genetically engineered and organic tend to be treated diametrically opposed. And to Raoul's left, Katherine DiMatteo. Did I pronounce that correctly, Katherine?
Yeah.
She is a partner in Organic Specialists, served as the executive director of the OTA from 1990 until 2006. She is the executive director of the Sustainable Food Trade Association and a managing partner at Wolf, DiMatteo and Associates, a consulting firm whose specialists deliver effective strategies to help organic products and businesses grow. And finally, and not last, we have Diana S. Aga, who is joining us from the University of Buffalo. Diana is a professor of chemistry. Her research centers on investigating environmental chemistry, biological and ecological effects, and mitigation strategies of legacy and emerging contaminants in the environment. Diana has also worked on detecting and understanding the impacts of antimicrobials, persistent organic pollutants, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and endocrine disrupting chemicals, as well as nanotechnologies, nanoparticles. Thank you for joining us for this panel. So when I think about organic and this question of the future organic, I visualize organic agriculture as a string that has an anchor point. And currently there's a little bit of a current and the string is waving and the end ends up in different places. I think in order to really effectively have this conversation about the future, it would be helpful to have a little bit of an anchor in how we got to where we are in the idea of organic. So I wonder, Katherine, would you be able to walk us through, or willing, just a quick idea of the origins of the idea of organic and how that manifested to today?
Certainly. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here at this session. Can you hear in the back? Okay, great. Well, back in around the Green Revolution period in the 1930s and 40s, when some chemical inputs were introduced not only here in the United States but in other developing countries of the world as a way to increase yields and production, there were a number of observers of cultures and observers of agriculture in particular, Lady Eve Balfour and Sir Albert Howard in England, and Paul Keene of the United States, and Robert Rodale, J.I. Rodale, all of whom were looking at systems of farming and observing what was happening in those systems, and had seen that I would say, traditional practices of small communities of farmers aligned their farming practices with those of the natural systems and didn't have access to other chemicals or inputs to use to control pests, weed, diseases, or to increase fertilization on their farms. So in that observation, what they found is that those farms were productive and they were able to manage their systems with these practices that emulated nature, and they wrote about them at the time, and that was the beginning of what ended up being called organic agriculture. So it's been around for a while. The theory, the philosophy of organic has been around since that time. And then biodynamic also, Steiner in Austria and Germany had his version of the same observations, that we need to look at the world in terms of systems, and those systems should emulate nature to the best ability that they can in order to align with, rather than control or overcome nature to produce food and fiber products. So that was the beginning in terms of philosophy of organic. In the 70s, in the 1970s, there was a bit of an explosion in terms of the practitioners of organic. So here in the United States and Canada and Europe, you had a number of farmers who started to take up this. Of course, Organic Gardening Magazine and the Rodale Institute was very influential here in the U.S. about that. The publication helped a lot of people both in their backyard gardens and in commercial operations to take up this philosophy and apply it and use the practices that were being promoted for organic. And farmers began to sell their products as organic at farmers markets and direct sales to retail, both in, well, I think spontaneously and almost at the same time in the Northeast and in California and the Midwest, and farmer organizations were created at the time to help, exchange information about, well, what practices work, what didn't work, what can we do, what are you finding, and those organic farming associations eventually started to develop rules or guidance documents for what is the practice of organic. And as farmers were marketing their products as organic, they began to find that there was no control over who could say what was what. And they would compete with other farmers who would also call themselves organic in a direct market situation. Principally, there was also some grain producers who were selling, through grain mills, and commodity producers like beans and pulses that were selling, for dried sales, both retail and commercial. So anyway, without extending it, the idea of regulations or certification came out of this. How do we salvage or protect the principles that have been captured in the guidance documents and give a definition so that people would have some sort of roadmap to follow to say that they were organic? That developed into state programs where they became state regulations, and then by the mid-1980s, there's like 17 different states in the U.S. that had organic regulations. So if you happen to want to sell to Oregon and then California, you would have to follow two different sets of state standards and get certified and paid for that, et cetera, et cetera. There was a push from producers and small handlers and certification agencies and mainly environmental and consumer groups to go for a federal law, which was written in 1990 based on stakeholder input during 1988 and 89. That was the Organic Foods Production Act. So it was legislated at that time over the objection of the ag committees. So it went to a floor vote and succeeded to be passed and signed into law. Then 10 years of regulatory discussions among stakeholder groups, the National Organic Standards Board, final regulation in 2000, final implementation, in 2002, and the USDA organic seal that you can see on multiple products now is the result of this national certification and approval system and set of regulations for organic farmers. It is not necessarily a baseline or a ceiling. You, as an individual producer or as a group of producers or as a company, you can have additional requirements to the federal law that identify your particular product.
Thank you. And so organic is a label. It is a cropping system. It is a set of standards. And for many of us, it's a belief system. When we talk about the future of organic, Raoul, could you speak to what does that mean for you? What part of that is in the future of organic, if all of it or a specific portion?
I have to admit that I come at it from a very production-oriented view. And the future of organic looks quite rosy from this point in time. There's increasing demand, and there is more growers. There are more growers that are growing organic. But if you look at the big picture, though, right now there's about 1% of cultivated land that's organic out of roughly 400 million acres of cultivated land in the U.S. There's about 4 million acres of organic, and so 1% isn't a great deal. And there's also imported food. So the question for the future, I think, is how much is organic going to expand, and what are the limitations, perhaps, of that will slow down that expansion, or the opportunities that will speed it up. So one thing I see at this point is that the cost of organic food is significantly higher, and I think that's a barrier to increasing sales. And then if you look at the main fertilizer source for organic. It's animal waste products. It's manure that's made into compost. It's feather meal. It's blood meal. It's fish emulsion. It's all these products. And if you look at what the sources of those are and how many acres they could provide nutrients for, it seems like there's a cap of existing a cap of land that could possibly be fertilized or organically, but that cap is maybe 10 to 20 times what could be farmed now. So if in the future, and if the future is 50 years or 100 years, there's a lot of opportunity for organic to expand, but it may reach a point where the nutrients just aren't there. So I think that's one of the big limiting factors, although from a 1% point of view, expanding 10 times or 20 times seems like a tremendous opportunity for expansion. So
it's complicated, right? So you're coming at it from a production side,
yes. And
I wonder, and if you're finding that your customers have the same kind of viewpoint of what organic is and what the future, what they'd like to see happening in the future with their food.
Well, I mean, we're in an interesting spot here because we get to farm in Boulder County, which, just look at the turnout in this room. This is pretty fantastic that all of you want to take time out of your day to come and talk about our future and what food's going to look like for our community and beyond, especially under organic production. So I think there's pockets of it throughout the world where it's caught on like wildfire, and really the people all of you out here are the driving forces behind it, which are supporting those of us up here who are directly involved in creating the industry, making it happen, propelling our work forward. What I see here in our community is people really want to have a connection with where their food is grown and to who's growing it. Food is a very intimate thing that we do 3 times a day, hopefully. Those shakes you have for breakfast do count. And having a connection again to the larger community is something that we value. So there's an intrinsic value to it as well as tangible, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, while we are a certified organic farm, and I do completely believe in that, really I think what's almost more important right now is the relationship. People don't farm. There aren't too many gardeners out there anymore growing the majority of their own food, although we'd love to see that rise. So creating a place where that connection happens, where people can all of a sudden have a relationship with their food before it gets in plastic, is really important. And I think that's truly what our customers are looking for in the sense of the future of organic. I think the majority of our new customers that come to join our CSA or start coming to market regularly usually come because, one, they have a health issue, and all of a sudden they've made that correlation that food and health are on the same parallel, right? They're on the same horizon. They have a relationship. New families are the second largest group of people who come and join our CSA, our farmers market, because all of a sudden you're caring for this little human being, and you want to create the best possible health you can for this person. And so we start to think about food as medicine, food as part of our well-being. And I can't think of a customer this past Saturday at the farmers market that asked me if I was certified organic. But they did ask, where do you grow? How is your livestock raised? Is this grown indoors? What do you use for fertility? These are all questions we just had on Saturday down on the market street. So I feel like that relationship piece is almost more important than having that certified organic stamp in the direct markets. Now, in the grocery store, truly, I feel like having that USDA seal in the grocery store really helps you know, like we just heard about, that the standards for production are the same throughout the states, and Quality International, and there's a few other international certifiers adhere to the same rules. So if it is those cherry tomatoes that you just can't live without this time of year coming from Mexico, that's okay. You know, I mean, it still has to do with standards are still the same, which that was a really wonderful thing for consumers to just know what you're actually getting out there. So the answer short and sweet is organic production. I think people care about it, but right now I'm seeing the trend be more towards who's growing it, how is it grown, where is it grown, what's the relationship around it.
Mm-hmm. Have you, Raoul or Anne, have you seen, I think it's often implied or perhaps perceived that organic production means healthy, sustainable, regenerative, all of these things that are good for the earth, good for us. Is that correlation accurate?
One of the seminal events that Kathleen didn't mention is the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And I recently, I'm going to flatter myself and say I recently reread it, and it is still so relevant and still so powerful, even though agriculture has changed a great deal and many of the toxic materials that were applied in the 50s and 60s are now gone. The tone of it and the principles behind it are still very powerful. And so health, I think, is a tremendous driver of organic, and it's one of the reasons that people will continue to buy it and support it. And the tricky part about this, though, is that really what we want as a country is a healthy crop system for 100% of the cropland, not just for 1%. And so Rachel Carson certainly was supportive of organic agriculture and had a huge impact on organic agriculture. But it's also important to take the view that we want the entire food system to be a healthy food system, and that's a lot more challenging.
Diane, in terms of your focus, back to this question of the health of the planet, for lack of a better term, soil health, ecosystem health, how these things, how organic contributes or not to these. What are you finding, black plastic use, various ingredients that go into organic farming that allow the less use of pesticides, herbicides, those kinds of things? Are those consistent with this overall idea of health?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, science and community, are all wanting to have healthy environment. I think there's no question we all want clean environment, right? And as I'm sitting here and listening, I actually, it brought back my childhood. So I grew up in the Philippines where there's so many people and so little food, right? So, but as you mentioned about fertilizing with manure, and that's how we grow our vegetables, right? We fertilize with manure. We grew our own chickens and pigs using, I didn't know what is called now organic. Back then, I just know it's what we use, right? Manure and natural things. But at the same time, we also eat a lot of rice. And now that I'm a scientist, I just realized that what we've been consuming, which is miracle rice and golden rice, are genetically engineered. Mm-hmm. But it produced the amount of rice necessary to feed the whole country and many Asian countries. So I never thought about whether it's organic or non-organic. And actually, fast forward, before I became a professor, I worked in Bayer Corporation, which also has manufacturing of pesticide. So I'm in the evil side, right? We were manufacturing pesticide. And my job is to do the registration through the Environmental Protection Agency. But what I learned from working there is actually a lot of this, well, at least that company I work for, is very responsible environmentally and socially, that a lot of the bad pesticides that we find out are toxic or very persistent in the environment, they don't go through the registration. So the pesticides now are very degradable, so not like the DDT that was in the Silent Spring, which has a lifetime of 25 years, 30 years, which even that they're banned now for a long time, we can still see them in soil, in water. But the pesticides now, the modern pesticides, they degrade in 2 days, sometimes hours, depending on when they are being used, depending on what their targets are. And they're also very water soluble now, that when you wash the fruits, you can remove it from your apple, from your pears. So knowing all that, I actually don't buy organic food because I know to wash them. I also, but I'm also an environmental chemist, so my work, my research is actually looking at how can we treat these contaminated sites so that it doesn't affect people. In fact, one of my main research is to how can we convert dairy manure that are produced from these there's these confined feeding operations. So in New York, we have so many large dairy farms that are using antibiotics to cure diseases and prevent diseases. So there are antibiotics in manure, but I guess if correct me if I'm wrong, if they use antibiotics, the manure cannot be used for organic farming. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay, okay. So my main goal is to, in that work actually, our concern is to prevent the antibiotics from going into the environment, because now we are getting this resistant bacteria because of the antibiotics present in the environment. So we are looking for ways to treat this manure before they can be spread, so that we can remove the antibiotics, we can kill resistant bacteria, and then we can use the manure to put back the organic matter to fertilize the fields. So I think I respect the people that support organic. I think it's important. But I also worry about the production of food that we need as we have growing population.
Catherine?
I'd like to just add a couple of things into the questions that you've asked. And first of all, I think I would like to say that it's not only manure that fertilizes organic fields, and it's not only compost. One of the key principles and the key practices of organic is around crop rotation and cover crops. And that the use of crop rotation and cover crops, turning high nitrogen crops back into the soil, is one of the many very good practices that can be used to fertilize soil, so we're not dependent. And composting, of course, is one of the things that we would promote as a better use as opposed to raw manure or lagoon manure for fertilization, because both because of the limitations of the source of fertilizer, and also because for environmental and sustainable reasons, by using cover crops and crop rotations, you're also sequestering carbon into the soil. You're drawing it down from the atmosphere and sequestering it into the soil and not releasing it as much as through regular tillage farming practices. So we're actually having a positive impact on climate as well in that way. Those types of practices are not confined to organic. And what I've been seeing is that there's a lot of farming that's now adopting these good farming practices or alternative farming practices because there's success to those practices, and because even our government, our conservation stewardship programs are helping farmers understand that if they do crop rotations and cover crops, they can reduce their use of chemical or petroleum-based fertilizers and avoid some of the problems with manures and antibiotics. And they're going to also help in terms of this reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by over-tilling or, not sequestering enough carbon to offset. There are other practices. So organic practices can be used whether you're certified organic or not. And when I think of the future of organic, I think of it in terms of the practices or the good practices that come from the philosophy of organic, and then the knowledge that we've gained over, well, now 70 or 80 years of writings and practices and practitioners in organic, that these practices can become part of the overall farming system, and therefore we can, have a production system that is both productive in its yields, but also eliminate overuse of limited resources and reduce additional toxic exposures.
Could I say something? Yeah, please. So cover crops, and mostly it's legumes, which are plants that fix nitrogen. They have a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria, and they can take nitrogen out of the air. But the use of cover crops adds essentially one nutrient, which is nitrogen. And the crops need more than that, and that's one of the charms of animal manures and compost, is that they have a potassium and phosphorus and the calcium and magnesium. It's a much more complete package. So while I really love cover crops, they add a lot of organic matter, and the crops following them do well, but it can be challenging to grow them. It can be expensive to grow them. I live in basically a dry, arid state where cover crops take irrigation, and so it can be some pretty expensive nitrogen. But they are part of our farming practice. The other fascinating thing, though, is that you asked a question about manure from conventionally raised animals in organic, and it's both. Organic farming is doing agriculture as a whole a great service by recycling a lot of those animal wastes back to the land. And there are conventional growers that recycle animal waste, but it's organic growers that are applying a lot of compost, a lot of urban green waste that's made into compost back to the land. And so it's a huge service, but it's ironic, though, that the conventional dairies where the animals are fed a conventionally grown corn and soybeans and alfalfa that were grown using nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, it gets recycled through those animals and then is used in organic agriculture. So on one hand, there's kind of a symbiosis between organic and conventional agriculture that makes both work better, but it's not something that a lot of people think about.
On the issue of cost, cost comes up repeatedly, and there are reasons that organic is more expensive. My understanding primarily because of a lot of the labor involved, but seeds and inputs and various things. But you mentioned something, Raoul, which is this idea of eco-services. Organic farming providing some level, carbon sequestration as an example, in what you're at least referencing. Do you foresee a future where farmers will be paid for those kinds of values they create beyond the fruit of the plant that they're selling?
Well, in a way, they're being paid for those services now because they're getting higher prices. And so as long as consumers see that the benefit of organic farming is healthier land and healthier farms, healthier farmers, healthier food, then those ecosystem services are being paid for by the consumer. And I guess the question in some minds is that can the consumer afford those ecosystem services, even though they're really wonderful?
Anne? How did you know I wanted to talk to this, Brian? I'm going going to just dare to say you're actually paying the true cost of food when you buy direct organic agriculture, direct organic products.
Yep.
You know, that cheeseburger that maybe you had for lunch, do you know how long that took to get to your plate? It took 2 years of the cow being on the ground after it was gestated for 9 months. So that's almost 3 years before that burger ended up on your plate. That bunch of carrots down at the market that I sell for $3 a bunch, which is about 1.5 pounds, you know, that's 60 days for an early to mid-season variety. It's amazing the amount of time that we forget that actually goes into our food. And all of the behind-the-scenes costs, right? Not just labor, but the cost of seed, the cost of water, the cost of creating a healthy ecosystem, which is, and I'm going to beg to argue a little bit, whether you're conventional or organic in agriculture, you're still passionate about creating a healthy ecosystem. There's, you know, whether you're doing the soy, fallow, soy wheat rotation, it's a rotation out there, versus if you're doing a cover crop rotation of peas or a mixed variety of legumes, as well as cereal grains and things, which a lot of your farmers here in Boulder County do, these off-season, these winter season mixes to add fertility. All of this is going into that one thing that we get to sell. So I guess I'd like to just challenge you to think about, why is food so cheap? Why is food so cheap when it takes that much time, that much effort, that much labor, that much input in creating these ecosystems, right? Which is really the foundation of our health, as well as the ecosystem health. So yeah, there's, and the other piece is, of course, a lot of food is subsidized, right? So let's just mention this: the government subsidies that are out there for commodity crops and commodity crops and larger producers.
That's where I wanted to jump in, if you hadn't gotten there, is to say that most food doesn't reflect its true cost. And all of your tax dollars that are used in the Agriculture Department to support in subsidies and research, and in the Environmental Protection Agency, and in pollution control and pollution cleanup, and disaster cleanup, and drought or flood extra costs. All those things affect the cheapness of food. So you're paying, and the environment's paying, and your neighbors are paying, everyone is paying for the cost of food the way we have the system today. And so when you are buying organic, which you're buying if you buy at a premium, which in most cases is the case, you're paying, and you're willing to dip into your pocket again and pay that extra cost. But if people were actually able to account for all the costs that went into all the food, and all the food was reflected, I think you'd see an equalization of the costs. There is movements and accounting and banking systems that are looking at true cost accounting, and they're trying to take into account these ecosystem services, also all the costs of subsidies, disasters, pollution cleanup, et cetera, research and development, all those, and trying to figure out, can we come up with, can there be a different way for us to value because we're talking about food, our food and agriculture, but it could reflect on other things. I don't know if we're there yet. It's probably a long way away, but at least those conversations and theories are being started, and there's the people are sitting down with pen and paper or computer and trying to find out the algorithms of coming up with this. And I recently listened to a panel. It was in the UK, and it was a panel of different experts, and they were talking about impacts of Brexit and the fact that they would have to come up with new agricultural programs and policies. And a number of the people on that panel were actually seeing it as an opportunity for them to perhaps rebuild their policies around food and agriculture to, to take into, to incentivize through different policies and the restructuring of the economic system around food, that farmers would choose to use other practices, and then the cost could be more equalized in terms of how it was delivered, and they could use money to build infrastructure, for instance, abattoirs in rural areas which don't exist. So right now you have to send your animals further away for slaughter than you've ever had before, and that's many monopolies happening around those kinds of things. Anyway, long story short, her one quote that I remembered is she said, "I don't want to rely on premium pricing to save the planet or human health." And I think that that is some aspirational goal that has gotten me very excited recently. Sorry for the rant.
That would be amazing if they could get to that point of understanding the relative values of these different systems. So there's something I'm still a little uncomfortable with, and that is the idea. For me, organic was always rooted in the ground and natural systems, granted perhaps a romantic ideal, but I believe in it. Now, organic is going through changes. We're seeing a little bit more with recent changes to the standards, a little more science, a little more technology being added to the systems. Organic started, as you said, Catherine, as a reaction to technology and some of the synthetic inputs. Is more science and technology going to save organics?
Well, I'm not sure it needs to be saved. I think it's going to continue successfully for some time to come because, one, I think people like growing food organically, and clearly a lot of people like eating it as well. But one of the things that you refer to indirectly is hydroponics. And recently the NOSB, and that's the National Organic Standards Board, and the USDA Organic Program decided that they were going to continue allowing hydroponics to be organically certified. Yes, thank you. And for idealists who think of crops needing to be grown in the soil, that seems like a bad idea. But for a lot of urban growers who are trying to grow healthy food in an environment where there isn't soil, and so I'm from California. We have produce year-round, but if you're in Minnesota or Vermont, you don't. And if you can grow hydroponically produced crops using organic standards and grow healthy food and provide it locally, I think that's a great benefit.
Yes, Diana.
Yeah, I just want to add two things unrelated. First, I think some of the definitions are changing, and I just recently learned actually in one of the workshops I've been. So streptomycins are antibiotics that are produced by bacteria. So when they are used in orchards, apple orchards, and pears to fight fire blights, they used to be called organic, right? Because streptomycin is produced by naturally occurring bacteria. But more recently, I think the USDA or maybe the FDA changed it to it's no longer organic, because now we're seeing that streptomycins are actually contributing to the emergence of antibiotic resistance. So there are some changes that are driven by science. In a different thought, completely unrelated to what I just said, in science right now we actually have a National Science Foundation funded project called source separation, which means, so urine is very rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. And urine, when you put it in the wastewater treatment plants, is only 1% of the volume that we are treating, that we use a lot of energy to treat the wastewater, the municipal wastewater, before it can be discharged into the environment so that we don't have eutrophication or algal blooms, so we prevent all this nitrogen, excess nitrogen in the environment. So what if from the source, from our toilet, we separate urine already and we don't put it in the wastewater? So we save a lot of energy to treat our waste. So what do you do with the urine? Obviously, it is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. So we are finding ways to apply it in the field, so it's really organic, right? So, but then there's this yuck factor. I mean, would you eat your cabbage that was fertilized with your own pee? So it's a little bit difficult for some people to think about. And also, our urine has a lot of other chemicals. So when you take antibiotics and pharmaceuticals and antidepressants, a lot of them actually end up in your urine. So you're putting it back in your cabbage, in your carrots. And we have seen that actually when you use urine to fertilize fields, because we have a field plot, some of these crops take up the antibiotics and pharmaceuticals, and it even goes into the core of the carrot. So even if you peel the carrot, it will still have ibuprofen or caffeine. So the science is driving the organic world also in terms of how can we capture all these nutrients so that we can put it back in the land without the bad consequences of putting undesirable chemicals.
I guess I'll just make one clarifying statement. Under the regulations, you would not be able to use urine in certified organic production.
Ibuprofen carrots, it's really not that bad an idea. You get fiber as well as the...
I'm going to pick at this just once more. Here, April 1995, the National Organic Standards Board definition of organic was: organic agriculture is an ecological production management system that promotes and enhances biodiversity, biological cycles, and soil biological activity. It is based on minimal use of off-farm inputs and on management practices that restore, maintain, and enhance ecological harmony. That's 1995. Are we moving towards a definition, to your point, Diana, that the definition is changing? Are we moving towards a definition that is not what it is, but what it's not? It's not GMOs. It's not pesticides and herbicides. It's not synthetics.
I don't think so. I think that the farming system is the driving force of the whole thing. That if you have a productive farming system, you could add technological inputs into it that might tweak it and make it better. But you need the system, the ecologically based farming system, to start with. That's what really makes it all work. And maybe you can tweak it, make it a little better, but those improved seeds or those other technologies that might be added, they're just a really small part of the bigger picture that needs to be maintained.
And I think to your question, trying to understand a production system or a philosophy, it's difficult to convey in sound bites. And all those prohibitions of what it is not are a lot easier to say quickly and to be understood quickly. But the basis of those prohibitions is the system and the philosophy and the production practices. So I think in the 90s and in 1995, well, for the history of this regulation, and that's not the only history of organic, but when we were trying to convey why the system was different, why we wanted to be regulated, what the regulation would actually guarantee in terms of that label, if you leave it, and I'm sorry if anybody's a PR, advertising, or marketing person in the room, I'm going to, the advice from those fields was you have to make it simple and communicate clearly in ways that people could understand. I think today access to information is easier, and I think the understanding of complex issues, and I may be a Pollyanna here, but I think people are capable of understanding complex issues and seek to know things in ways that are more complex than before. And the emergence of this discussion about regenerative agriculture and regenerative organic and sustainability and pros and cons, I think that's illustrates, at least from the production end, that we're looking at this in a more complex way, and what we are beginning to try to communicate is the complexity of production and the complexity of organic. And yes, all those things that we're not are what people remember most quickly, but I think that you can find your way from there to what we are, and I don't think that we've changed that definition at all.
I do think the definition gets a little blurred, and with application. For instance, there's a lot of people think like, oh, it's organic. There's no pesticides. There's no herbicides. There are, but like Deb spoke to, it has a different life. It's more water soluble. So I guess really it's not one has chemicals, one doesn't have chemicals. It's not that cut and dry in either world. But I think what's important is to understand, how the application takes place in order to grow whatever food a farm is growing.
I'd like to move to audience questions, and a couple of these tie directly in. So I'm going to ask a couple of them together because they're going to have some relevance. Question: how can we expect to continue this upwards trend of interest in organic foods? And by the way, the numbers on the OTA website indicate that it grew from 3.6 billion in 1997 to 46 billion today. That's quite an increase over 20 years. How can we expect to continue this trend when a large part of the population doesn't have access to them or can't afford them? So that's the cost question. There's also, how does socioeconomic privilege come into play when choosing organic, which comes, I think, primarily back to the cost question: how can it be affordable? And that ties somewhat into the question here, I think, for you, Raoul, especially, what does organic mean relative to GMO? Can GMOs play a bigger role in the future of organic?
Those are a lot of questions.
You got to narrow it down.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let's go with GMO. Let's start there.
So my wife and my wife is a plant geneticist, and she has used genetic engineering tools. She works in rice, and by the way, as of today, there are no genetically engineered rice varieties in the world. There may be someday, but not yet. So we've had a lot of conversations, Pam and I, about genetic engineering and sustainability and organic, and we both agree, actually, that the farming system is the basis, or a ecologically based farming system is the basis for a successful farming system, a sustainable farming system, and organic farming has chosen by law not to allow genetically engineered traits, and there are a variety of them, ranging from herbicide tolerance, which is perhaps the most famous, to a papaya ring spot virus resistant papayas that are grown in Hawaii, and so it's very hard to talk about GMOs because there's just really a wide variety of possibilities. From my point of view, I think that there are problems there are pest problems in organic agriculture that could be helped by improved varieties, and these varieties could be improved with genetic engineering. They could be improved with CRISPR, which is a new way of changing the genes of plants. I have problems on the farm that I can't control using organic practices. I can sort of manage them, but if I had resistant varieties to symphyolins or resistant varieties to viruses, it would make it easier for me to grow things. But I think the bigger picture is what role does genetic engineering play in the development of a more sustainable agriculture? So one of the possibilities is resistant varieties to diseases and insects that allow conventional growers to reduce pesticide use. And I think that's the biggest opportunity. But if they were just, for the conventional growers, if it was just using these tools to reduce pesticide use, that would be good. But if that was combined with these growers with more ecologically based farming practices, that would go a lot further. So there are opportunities for genetically modified crops, both in organic and in conventional. I'm hoping that it can have a bigger impact on the 99% of cropland that's not being farmed organically. In terms of pesticide reduction, there are pesticides applied in organic agriculture, but it's just a way, way lower number than is applied in conventional systems, and generally significantly less toxic materials. So genetically engineered traits could help organic. They're not going to reduce pesticide use, I don't think, but they could improve yields, which would, possibly be good. But the bigger role for them, I think, is going to be reducing both pesticide use and perhaps synthetic fertilizer use in conventional systems.
Looking at simplifying this other question a little bit, the question, I believe, is will organic continue to grow if cost doesn't come down? Is cost going to be a significant barrier to the growth of organic production and sales?
What I think is interesting in with that question is I'm still selling that same bunch of carrots that I like to just keep going back to today. I'm still selling that same bunch of carrots in 2018 for what I sold it to in 2003 at the Pike Place Market in Washington State. It's the exact same price. So everything else has increased because really you hit this threshold. I'm not going to pay more than a certain price. I just can't. It's not, the money's not there. But everything else continues to rise, right? Your gasoline, your seed costs, your labor costs. What's gonna, even here in Boulder County at $15 an hour for minimum wage, I'm not sure we can still keep those carrots at $3. We may see agriculture shift towards crops that do better in smaller, different areas and generate more income per square footage, per acre, so that we can cover costs differently, and that may limit some of what we actually have to offer out there. So I think that's a really interesting question, but a lot of the prices for direct retail haven't risen. I think if anything, they've dropped or they've risen such small percentages in the wholesale market in order to kind of keep it where it was, just another interesting number, that box of salad mix we all buy in the grocery store in the early 90s when organic certification was coming about. Those used to sell for, wholesale lettuce at that point was about $15 for a 3-pound box. It's currently $7.50 for a 3-pound box in the grocery store before it goes into that little package. Of what they package up, or the pack houses turn into the half-pound boxes. So prices continued to go down, and what happens then is it forces smaller farms like us and smaller ones than us out. And so and how this kind of fits into the larger conversation of what Raoul was saying is, if you really do believe in ecosystem health and regenerative agriculture and taking care of your ecosystem, and what's the true cost of eco-mitigation, if I can use that term, for all of these other things that agriculture does, where does that cost of that bunch of carrots going into your refrigerator pay for all of those things if it doesn't continue to absorb the expenses as they rise over the years? In terms of losing small farmers, then we come into an ethical piece of it, right? Losing small farmers, losing habitat for wildlife habitat around farms, other wild species that a lot of farms kind of create. Because really, what we do as a farm is we go in and we wipe out the habitat that's there, and we create our own agricultural ecosystem out there, right? That still has a ton of beneficials and pests and everything we want to kind of be in. Our goal is to be in symbiotic relationships where they balance each other out. So we don't need these pesticides. So we don't need off-farm fertility. We can generate our own on-farm fertility. So if we don't have a rising cost, percentage-wise, it can be very small for our overall cost of what cost of living is. But if we don't have a rising cost and everything else is rising, how? I think the better question is, how are we going to keep farmers producing food? Really, and a diversified group of farmers producing food, not just monocrops out there, which we haven't got to talk much about that, but that's definitely not a regenerative worldview right there in agriculture.
Thank you. And sorry, go ahead, Raoul.
I just wanted to ask one of my metrics when talking to small farmers is asking them, what kind of health insurance do you have? Because things like that are hugely expensive to a small farmer. Or do they have health insurance for their employees? Or and you start asking these questions, and you realize these small growers have a wonderful lifestyle and love their work, but they're not making a lot of money doing it.
Do you foresee in the future that organic farmers, small, what we think of like family, community-oriented organic farmers can have a middle-class living?
I think you'd have to define middle class first of all, and I think there are certainly probably some farmers that do fall into that category already, that have, their systems have and their markets are such that they can, make that living that supports all their necessities plus, which would put them somewhere in a middle class. I think the whole question of pricing and cost and access to food in general and to organic food, I tried to address it before when I was talking about that cost, the cost and the economics, and we'd have to really deconstruct our whole, not just food and farming economic system. We'd have to deconstruct our whole economic system, and in order to right the wrongs or to make, to provide equity. Processed products, which make up the majority of the food that's sold and eaten, no matter, I guess, which economic level you live on, they are actually very that's very costly food per nutrient or per volume or or per hunger pain, and yet it's what drives down the cost overall of food and the value that people have on the cost of food. There was an interesting chart that was done recently by the United Nations, and it showed it was what they were trying to show in the chart was that how little here in the United States we actually do pay for food anyway. That they took a bean stew, so no meat, none of the high cost proteins, just a bean stew that you could eat anywhere in the world. And the cost in the U.S. for a serving of that bean stew was something like $1.25 or something like that. And yet in other countries it was $300 in their economic system. So, you know, the cost of food it's so complex, and I don't know what's going to solve that problem. There are urban gardens, the urban garden movement, the CSA movement, the farmers market movement. All those movements initially were started to try to bring access fresh local foods and organic foods to inner city and lower income populations. And SNAP, and in Massachusetts we have a program called HIP, which is you get double the value of your SNAP dollars to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. So you're actually getting money back. So if you spend $1, you actually get $2 back in your next SNAP thing. Good. Oh, that's great. So there's been all these schemes like to do this, and it has helped, but it still hasn't solved the problems of access and cost. And I think it's going to take more brilliant people than myself anyway to figure it out. It's complex, and you know, where the money goes in the food system is concentrated. A lot of it is in handlers and middle people. It's in distribution. It's not at the farm level, and it's not at the consumer level. You know, so it's all the things that happen in between. And we've gotten used to cheap food. That $1.25 for a serving of a meal is what we want. And if it's any more than that, we say, oh, no, it's too expensive, especially when you try to compare it to your other rising costs, as the farmer have to deal with, as we all have to deal with, too. So there's an economic imbalance, and that makes for social injustice imbalance as well, because we're all at different levels of the pyramid.
Thank you. And a lot of the audience here is very interested in this socioeconomic dynamic behind organic, and it ties back to the question about privilege. What kind of solutions might address that gap? Are there any?
Healthy food is not a right of the privileged, it's a right of everyone. Healthy food starts with education. What'd you pack in your kids' lunch today? How much of it was processed? Do those carrots that you pack for them come home uneaten, but the Z-bar eaten? So each one of us can play a huge role in this education piece. This is a huge beginning of the socioeconomic piece of getting rid of the mindset that organic food is just for rich people. You know, here at our farmers markets, Boulder County farmers markets, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're still one of the top 5 farmers markets in the country, right? Like volume-wise, generating food.
We're the best.
Well, I'm just throwing that out there because if you ask a lot of people locally here, they don't want to shop at the market because it's too expensive. And, you know, I've been down there since 2002, and there's a lot of farmers. Before we had this double up grant that lots of people wrote, but farmers on the street, we were all given half price to anybody who came up and paid with SNAP out of our own pockets. There was, I don't know, back me up, at least 6, 7, 8 of us on the street doing this, all organic growers, because we wanted, it means that much to us, to get rid of this wrong myth, get rid of this myth that organic food is just for the wealthy. That's not what it's for. The farmer's market is for everyone. That simple action of doubling food up for people who had, you know, the SNAP bucks and whatnot was huge because it increased the amount of people that were coming down to the market. And all of a sudden, now they're buying plants. Now they're growing their own seeds. Now we have these relationships. They're coming to farms. They're volunteering. There's all these different, it has this ripple effect, which is just intangible. You can't put a dollar effect on it. But the education piece is what's going to be huge to change the socioeconomic burden. that cheap food, that Lunchables that we pack in our kids' lunch, just because we run out of time. Time is the biggest commodity, right, that we all wrestle with in life. We never have enough time to do the things. Sometimes to do the things that mean the most to us, we decide to cut out the time for that. And healthy food is a huge one of them. But if we can get the education piece in at a younger age in our schools, in our homes, just in our regular practice and lifestyles, that's going to be a huge piece of why people are going to be more excited to not buy that six-pack of Coca-Cola, but to go to the market and buy their fresh fruits and vegetables. Soapbox, sorry about that. That means a lot to me.
Anybody else?
I have one more example of how another small way to address that problem. It was determined that UC Davis, which is a state school and has a tuition maybe similar to CU Boulder here, that the gross income of 45% of the student families that are attending the school is about $50,000 or below $50,000 or less. So that means that there are families sending their kids to school who are paying tuition and they have their own expenses at home, that there are food insecurity issues for 45% of UC Davis students. So we started a program at the student farm where we divert our surplus and seconds and odd lots of produce to a pantry on campus where UC Davis students can access local, fresh, organic produce. And it may not always be perfect, but sometimes it's perfect. And it's been a very successful and widely used program. Last year, 10,000 pounds of produce was donated by the student farm to the pantry and disappeared into the student body. So every farm has seconds. Every farm has a surplus at times. Things don't sell. Things come back from the farmer's market. And there are food banks and pantries that are happy to take that food. And I don't think it hurts the growers if they can figure out a way to do it without too much added expense.
I'll just add one point onto this because our markets are very much interested and involved in the food access piece. And I think a lot of the successful programs we're seeing are just grassroots programs. Helping your neighbor grow, the program like Growing Gardens, a local organization, it's those. The top down is very helpful. Double Up Food Bucks, incredibly helpful. But just getting people reconnected to the earth and actually growing something, I think, is a great way to address some of these issues. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is just go one by one and say whether you are bullish on the future of organic or not, and why. And we don't have to start with Ann if you don't want to start.
Oh, I don't care.
All right, go for it.
I believe in the future of organic agriculture. I think it's what led us all the way through time to the Industrial Revolution, right? Till we had the byproduct for chemicals. I think all different aspects of agriculture have a place out here to grow food for our world, and I think organic agriculture is a gateway for a lot of new farmers to come into that. The majority of new farmers who are coming into farming these days are not ag kids, have no agriculture experience, and this is a way that they have access to it. It's a bit less intimidating, perhaps, because there's a lot less mechanical aspects of it. And I'm a firm believer in regenerative agriculture. You can grow your ecosystems. I've seen it happen out on our farm, and I think it's going to be a mainstay for the future to come.
Thank you. Raoul?
I agree that the demand for health in food is really important, and organic agriculture is meeting that demand. And so I only expect it to increase because we all want to live forever. And this is one of the ways to help do it and help the planet at the same time. It's also true that one of the reasons that new growers can get into organic agriculture more easily than they can get into conventional agriculture is that direct marketing is really widely used. And what direct marketing means is that the grower gets the dollar value of the produce rather than a middle person. So CSAs, farmers markets, U-Picks, it's huge, especially if you don't have a lot of cash at the beginning. You go to the farmers market, you get paid cash. You have a CSA, you get paid ahead of time. And that's very different from the standard produce system. So it's going to attract new growers, and I think there's going to be increasing demand. So things look good.
I guess I would agree. I mean, I'm bullish on it, and I think it depends on what you're talking about, what you mean when you ask the question. Is there a future for organic food? Do you mean the label and more products and it being the mainstay? And if it was the mainstay of all the food that we had to choose from in, say, a retail setting, then maybe we wouldn't need the label anymore if we completely converted the system to organic. But I'm bullish on the fact that the practices, the principles behind the practices and even the regulations and the requirements of the rules themselves are sound. They're sound for yield. They're sound for environment, the health. I think they're sound for the economy. I think they're easy to emulate. I think they're would be easy to become part of what farming actually is, and I think we're seeing that. The other questions that had come up that we wrestled with in terms of pricing and cost and economics and access, I think that has to be worked out somewhere else other than a discussion about organic itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good concept. It works here. It works in a lot of local community. I'm happy to hear that genetic engineering is not necessarily contradictory for organic concept, because I think we have to think globally that food is really scarce in other parts of the world. So we think about production also to feed the world. There's a lot of areas where they do not have enough food, and there's a lot of insects and pests that needed to be cured with pesticides. It's good to know that there are now really environmentally friendly pesticides that are not persistent anymore. And really the genetic engineering, I think, will play a key role so that we can create drought-resistant rice or vegetables, and also resistant to pesticides or to insects, so we don't need to apply a lot of pesticides.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and participating. Please help me thank our panelists.